Chicago, 1907. The city glowed with restless energy, gas lamps flickering against the wet cobblestones, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and ambition. Every corner hummed with danger, and every handshake carried a price. Beneath the noise and smoke of it all walked a man who didn't belong to the chaos, but who understood it better than anyone else. His name was Johnny Torrio, and before he became one of the most powerful underworld figures in American history, he was just another immigrant kid trying to survive. Torrio had come to New York from Italy as a boy, landing in the crowded slums of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Life there was simple. You worked hard, or got eaten alive. But Johnny wasn't like most kids. He wasn't loud or reckless. He watched, listened, learned. Where others threw punches, he calculated angles. Where others dreamed small, he planned big. He started as a shop clerk, then drifted into small-time hustling, protection money, gambling, little rackets that barely drew police attention. But even then, he operated with an elegance most thugs lacked. He wore clean suits, never raised his voice, and ran his affairs like a businessman rather than a street brawler. People began calling him the Fox. Not because he was sly in a cruel way, but because he moved through the underworld unseen, quick, deliberate, always one step ahead. By his mid-20s, Torrio had already caught the eye of Big Jim Colosimo, the man who ran Chicago's vice empire. Brothels, gambling dens, bootleg bars, all of it. Colosimo was charming and flashy, the kind of man who liked being noticed, but he lacked Johnny's discipline. So when Johnny came out from New York to help him organize his operations, it wasn't long before the student became the quiet master. Chicago fascinated Torrio. The city was rough and full of promise, a place where politics, money, and crime were woven together like threads in a dark tapestry. Every district had its boss, every police precinct its price, and Torrio saw opportunity in every handshake. He started building something bigger than Colosimo could even imagine. A system, a machine. Under Torrio's management, the rackets became organized, structured. He kept books, made investments, even arranged truces between rival gangs. He didn't want constant war, he wanted profit. And in a city where bloodshed was the usual form of business negotiation, that made him unique. But not everyone shared his patience. Around 1919, a restless young enforcer began working under Torrio, a stocky kid from Brooklyn with a scar on his cheek and a temper that flared like a fuse. His name was Alphonse Capone. Johnny took to him almost immediately. He saw in Capone what few others did, not just a brute, but a raw kind of charisma that could command both fear and loyalty. Torrio became a mentor, teaching the young man the golden rule of survival. You can get much farther with a kind word and a little money than with a gun. When Prohibition hit in 1920, the world changed overnight. Alcohol became illegal, and men like Torrio saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. While politicians made speeches about morality, Torrio quietly laid the foundations for an empire. He struck deals with breweries, arranged supply chains, bought off police, and built speakeasies across Chicago. The city turned into a gold mine of illegal liquor, and Torrio was at the center of it all, calm, controlled, unshakably polite as he raked in millions. But with every rise comes the shadow of envy. Other gangs began to see Torrio's success as a threat. Irish mobs, Jewish outfits, and Italian newcomers all wanted a piece of the action. Chicago, once orderly under Torrio's diplomacy, began to boil again. Big Jim Colosimo, the man who had once been Torrio's mentor, had grown soft. He liked the brothels, the showgirls, the easy life. He didn't want to expand into bootlegging, it was too risky. Torrio, on the other hand, knew bootlegging was the future. And when Colosimo refused to move forward, tensions began to simmer. One night in 1920, Colosimo was gunned down in his restaurant. No one ever proved who ordered it. The police blamed rivals, but everyone in the underworld whispered the same thing. Torrio had removed his old boss to clear the way for his empire. Johnny never confirmed it. He just nodded when asked and said softly, "Business moves on." With Colosimo gone, Torrio and Capone took over the operation completely. And that's when Chicago truly changed. Torrio built alliances with everyone: Irish bootleggers, Sicilian families, crooked cops, even city officials. Money flowed like the whiskey they smuggled, and Chicago became the beating heart of Prohibition. But power never goes unchallenged for long. Rival gangs wanted in. The North Side mob, led by the sharp and fearless Dean O'Banion, began muscling into Torrio's territory. O'Banion was unpredictable, bold enough to steal from Torrio's breweries and laugh about it later. Capone wanted him dead. Torrio, always preferring strategy to violence, tried to negotiate peace. Yet in the world they lived in, peace was temporary, and betrayal was currency. One afternoon in 1924, O'Banion tricked Torrio into buying a brewery that was about to be raided by the police. The arrest humiliated Torrio, who spent time in jail and watched his rivals grow stronger while he sat behind bars. When he got out, his calm demeanor was still there, but his patience had thinned. Capone wanted revenge, and for once, Torrio didn't stop him. What happened next would shake Chicago to its core and mark the beginning of Torrio's slow transformation from the quiet architect of order to a man caught in the storm he had tried so hard to control. The world of reason was giving way to the age of fire, and at the center of that blaze stood a man who had taught the most dangerous generation of gangsters how to think like kings. And soon, the student would eclipse the master. The winter wind cut through Chicago like a blade that year. The streets smelled of coal smoke, whiskey, and fear, the kind that clung to every alley and whispered in every bar. Johnny Torrio sat in his office above a quiet speakeasy near South Wabash, the steady rhythm of piano keys drifting up from below. He sat behind his desk, silent, the faint glow of a cigar ember illuminating the sharp lines of his face. Across from him, Al Capone leaned forward, eyes burning with excitement. "Dean O'Banion set you up, Johnny," Capone said, his voice tight with anger. "He made you look weak. The whole city's laughing at us. You can't let that stand." Torrio didn't answer right away. He hated being made a fool of, but he hated unnecessary bloodshed even more. Violence brought heat, and heat killed business. Still, O'Banion's betrayal was unforgivable. The brewery trap wasn't just a con, it was a public humiliation. Torrio's enemies now saw him as vulnerable. He exhaled slowly. "Not yet," he said finally. "We wait. We hit him only once the time's right, when no one will trace it back to us." Capone nodded, but his fingers drummed impatiently on the table. Torrio had built his empire on control. Capone thrived on chaos. Between them, a new balance of power was forming, one built on respect, but strained by the difference in how they saw the world. Weeks passed, and Chicago's underworld grew restless. O'Banion ran the North Side like a showman, flowers in his lapel, jokes on his tongue, a gun always nearby. He owned a flower shop near Holy Name Cathedral, a place where even his enemies came to buy roses for funerals. Irony followed him everywhere. Then one afternoon in November 1924, the balance shifted. Three men walked into O'Banion's shop under the pretense of business. Within moments, the quiet hum of conversation turned to silence. When the men left, O'Banion lay dead among the flowers. No one was ever charged, but everyone knew who had orchestrated it. Torrio's hand had been steady, precise, a professional's move. But in killing O'Banion, he had opened the gates to something he had long tried to avoid: an all-out gang war. O'Banion's crew swore revenge. His successors, Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, were not men of restraint. They were soldiers bred for vengeance. Suddenly, Torrio found himself the target of a war he never wanted. One cold afternoon in early 1925, Torrio returned to his apartment after visiting his wife. He parked his car, stepped out, and began walking toward the door. Then, gunfire. A car screeched to a stop, and shots exploded through the quiet street. Torrio dove for cover, but not fast enough. Bullets ripped through his coat, one grazing his jaw, another striking his chest. He fell to the ground, bleeding, dazed but alive. It was Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, O'Banion's men, striking back. They would have finished the job if a neighbor hadn't shouted, drawing attention. The attackers fled and Torrio was rushed to the hospital clinging to life. As he lay in bed, the world he had built spun out of control. Capone ran the business in his absence, expanding the empire with a mix of ruthlessness and charm. He paid off cops, intimidated rivals, and made himself the face of Chicago's underworld. Torrio watched from his hospital room as the student became the master. When he finally recovered, Torrio made a decision that shocked everyone. He called Capone to his bedside. "Al," he said softly, "you've got the fire. I've done my time. The world's changing and I'm not going to die for it." Capone looked stunned. "You're walking away, now? When we own this city?" Torrio smiled faintly. "That's exactly why. When you're on top, that's when you start falling. Don't make my mistake, don't stay too long." A week later, Torrio packed his things and quietly left Chicago. No farewells, no speeches, just a train ticket to New York and a heart still healing from the last war he'd ever fight. In the streets he left behind, the city transformed overnight. Capone filled the void with noise, power, and fury. Speakeasies thrived, bootlegging expanded, and Chicago became the center of organized crime in America. But for Johnny Torrio, the game wasn't over. Not yet. He was done with gunfire and street wars, but not with influence. Behind the scenes, he would still shape the future of the underworld in ways no one saw coming. Because Johnny Torrio had always believed that real power wasn't about being seen. It was about being remembered by those who made history, and quietly guiding them from the shadows. Johnny Torrio sat by the window of his quiet Brooklyn apartment, watching the world go by in silence. The Chicago skyline was far behind him now, but the memories of it still lingered like smoke he couldn't quite escape. The city had nearly taken his life, and yet a part of him missed it. The noise, the energy, the game itself. But he had learned something that few in his world ever understood. The smartest move sometimes wasn't fighting to stay on top, but knowing when to step away. After recovering from his wounds, Torrio slipped back into the East Coast underworld quietly. No one really knew where he lived, what he did, or who he met. But those who paid attention noticed that his name kept coming up in rooms where big decisions were made. He wasn't retired. Not really. He had just changed the way he played the game. Capone now ruled Chicago with thunder. Torrio had taught him the art of order and calculation, but Al had turned it into a spectacle. Headlines screamed his name. Reporters followed him like he was a movie star. He gave interviews, smiled for cameras, and threw lavish parties while the city bled underneath his empire. Torrio read about him often, sometimes shaking his head with a faint smile. He wasn't angry, he was proud. Capone was everything he had predicted: bold, unstoppable, and dangerously ambitious. But Johnny also knew that fame was a curse in their line of work. You couldn't be both a celebrity and a ghost, and ghosts were the ones who survived. By the mid-1920s, Torrio began re-establishing quiet connections. He reached out to old allies, men like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, younger gangsters who were reshaping New York's criminal landscape. They admired Torrio deeply. To them, he wasn't just a legend. He was a strategist, a teacher, a visionary who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't in petty street wars but in structure, organization, syndication. Luciano, ever ambitious, often visited Torrio in Brooklyn. Their meetings were calm and measured, two men discussing empire like businessmen, not outlaws. Luciano had his eyes set on unifying all the Italian factions in New York, something no one had ever managed. Torrio, sipping his espresso with quiet satisfaction, would nod thoughtfully. "You don't conquer the streets," he told Luciano. "You own them from above. You make the politicians need you, the bankers respect you, and the police look the other way. Build an organization so stable that even if one man falls, the system keeps moving. Luciano listened closely. Those words would later become the foundation of the modern mafia structure, the commission, an idea Torrio quietly planted and Luciano brought to life. Meanwhile, Torrio still watched Chicago from afar. Reports came in constantly: shootouts, arrests, political scandals, prohibition raids. The empire he'd built was richer than ever, but also far more volatile. Capone ruled with fear, not diplomacy, and his enemies multiplied faster than his allies. Torrio sent a few discreet warnings through trusted messengers. Keep your profile low. Don't taunt the government. Capone ignored them. By 1929, as the St. Valentine's Day massacre stained Chicago's history with infamy, Torrio knew it was only a matter of time before the empire collapsed under its own weight. That same year, Luciano and Lansky arranged a quiet meeting in Atlantic City, an unprecedented gathering of gang leaders from across the country. Torrio was there, sitting at the head of the table. He wasn't the loudest voice, but everyone deferred to him. The meeting marked a turning point. Torrio outlined his vision for the future, a national syndicate, where gangs cooperated instead of killing each other. Each territory would have control over its own operations, but share profits and settle disputes peacefully through a council. It was a corporate approach to organized crime, efficient, sustainable, and remarkably intelligent. The younger men loved it. For them, Torrio was the mentor they never had, a man who had survived when all the old bosses had died in gunfire or prison. Luciano later said that Torrio was the smartest man I ever met. That night, as the waves crashed outside the hotel and the boardwalk lights shimmered across the ocean, Torrio felt something rare: peace. He had built something larger than himself, something that would outlive them all. But peace was temporary in their world. Even as the national syndicate took root, Torrio knew danger never truly disappeared. It just waited for the right time to reappear. He began living quietly again, investing in legitimate businesses, real estate, laundries, construction. To most, he looked like just another successful immigrant businessman, but those in the know still treated him like royalty. Every so often, a man in a dark suit would visit his apartment to ask advice, to deliver a message, or to seek permission. Torrio never raised his voice, never made threats. He didn't need to. His name alone carried enough power to settle disputes without a single shot fired. Still, late at night, when the city quieted and the lights dimmed, he sometimes thought back to Chicago, to that narrow street where bullets nearly took his life, to the speakeasies he'd built, to the young man he'd mentored who had turned an empire into chaos. He'd won the game, but even victory came with ghosts. And though Johnny Torrio had escaped the city that once tried to kill him, fate wasn't quite done with him yet. The life he had shaped from the shadows was beginning to draw him back, not through violence but through legacy. Because in the underworld, no one ever really retires, not when the empire you built still runs on your name. By 1930, Johnny Torrio had become something of a myth, a name spoken softly in backrooms and whispered in the company of men who owed their fortunes to his ideas. He wasn't on the streets anymore, but his fingerprints were on every racket from coast to coast, every speakeasy, every gambling hall, every bootleg route that ran from Canada to New York, traced its roots back to the quiet strategies he had once drawn up in smoke-filled rooms. He lived simply now, in a modest Brooklyn brownstone with a view of the river. Neighbors thought he was just a polite, aging businessman who liked his morning walks and always tipped the paperboy. But inside those walls, Torrio was still the architect of something vast and invisible, a network of power that stretched far beyond city limits. Sometimes he'd meet with old associates, always careful, always discreet. Lucky Luciano visited often. They'd sit in the back room of a small cafe, drinking espresso and talking like two professors of a dark science. Luciano was the face of the new order now, young, charismatic, ruthless when needed, but disciplined enough to listen. Torrio liked that about him. "You've done what I always dreamed," Torrio said one evening, his tone thoughtful. "You made peace profitable." Luciano smiled. "You showed us how to think like bankers instead of thugs. The others fight for power. We build it." It was true. Under Torrio's influence, Luciano had restructured the mafia into a national syndicate, eliminating the old rivalries that had destroyed so many bosses before. Torrio's vision, the Commission, now governed organized crime across America. It was a system of balance, control, and cooperation. The violence never disappeared, but it became methodical, efficient, almost bureaucratic. For Torrio, this was the legacy he had always wanted, order where there had once been chaos. Yet even as he shaped this quiet empire, the world outside was changing fast. The Great Depression had thrown millions into poverty, and desperation fueled corruption like never before. Prohibition was nearing its end, and Torrio knew that the river of money that had built his generation's power was about to dry up. He wasn't worried. Not exactly. Torrio always thought 3 steps ahead. "When the liquor ends," he told Luciano, "gambling and unions will rise. There's always a new market for men who understand need." And he was right. The mob adapted, moving into labor racketeering, real estate, and legitimate businesses that blurred the line between lawful and criminal. Torrio had long believed the future of organized crime wasn't in breaking laws. It was in owning the men who made them. He began investing more heavily in legitimate ventures. Apartment complexes, trucking companies, import businesses, all clean, all profitable. Yet beneath it all ran the quiet hum of the machine he'd built years before, still turning, still feeding wealth to those he had mentored. Sometimes, while walking through Central Park on crisp mornings, Torrio thought about Chicago. The city that had nearly killed him was still a battlefield. Capone, once his brightest student, now reigned like a king under siege. The violence had grown absurd. Bombings, shootouts, raids. The government had made Capone their prime target, and Torrio watched from afar as the noose tightened. When Capone was finally convicted of tax evasion in 1931, Torrio wasn't surprised. He felt no joy, no sorrow, just inevitability. "He flew too close to the sun," he told Luciano quietly. "And the light always burns the boldest man first." But Torrio wasn't free of trouble either. In 1936, he was indicted for tax evasion himself, a familiar fate in that era. Yet unlike Capone, Torrio's case never turned into a spectacle. He surrendered calmly, cooperated quietly, and served a short sentence without complaint. His behavior earned him leniency, and by the time he walked out of prison, most of the world had forgotten he was even there. That was exactly how he wanted it. The years passed gently after that. Torrio grew older, softer around the edges, but his mind remained sharp as ever. He kept reading about the world, politics, economics, war. The criminal landscape he had once ruled had changed completely. The new generation of gangsters were flashier, louder, less disciplined. They wanted headlines, not harmony. Torrio would shake his head at their recklessness, the same way he once did with Capone. Every so often he'd receive visitors, men who still sought his advice. Some were young bosses from Chicago or New York. Others were old allies from the early days. They came for wisdom, not orders. Torrio always greeted them with quiet warmth, offering cigars, pouring wine, listening more than he spoke. His philosophy never changed. "Violence," he would say, "is only good business when it's invisible. Once it's seen, you've already lost." By the 1940s, Torrio had become a legend among those who knew the history. The newspapers rarely mentioned him anymore, but in the underworld his name carried reverence. Even men who'd never met him spoke about him with respect, the man who had taught the mafia how to think like an empire. Sometimes, when Torrio sat alone at night, he would wonder how long his creation would last. The world was changing, faster, louder, more dangerous. But he took comfort in knowing that for a time, he had brought reason to chaos. And though he no longer walked in the shadows of gangland streets, his influence lingered there. In every handshake, every unspoken deal, every coded word exchanged between men who thought they were making their own choices. They weren't. They were following rules written long ago by a man who had learned that true power didn't come from violence or fame. It came from understanding human nature and never needing to prove you controlled it. In the quiet aftermath of the 1930s, Johnny Torrio had become the invisible pulse behind organized crime. The man whose ideas still dictated the rhythm of every deal, every truce, every war that never made the headlines. He was no longer the man carrying a gun or calling hits. Those days were gone. Now his weapon was wisdom, sharper than any blade, more patient than any bullet. By 1935, he had become what many in the underworld whispered about: the gentleman of crime. He didn't curse, didn't yell, didn't threaten. He negotiated, he persuaded, he used reason like a scalpel. He believed in long games, in patience, in stability, and that made him something rare, a criminal philosopher. He still met with Lucky Luciano from time to time, but the tone of their conversations had changed. Luciano was now in full control of the American mafia, and the structure Torrio had imagined. The commission was alive, functioning, and terrifyingly efficient. Torrio's dream had come true, but even he couldn't deny that the dream had its own shadows. One night, in a dim cafe on Mulberry Street, Torrio and Luciano sat across from each other. Outside, the rain made the city glow like a painting. "Johnny," Luciano said, stirring his coffee, "sometimes I wonder if we've built something that can ever be controlled. These kids, they don't think before they pull a trigger." Torrio leaned back, eyes calm behind his thin glasses. "Power attracts chaos, Charlie. You can only shape it, never stop it. But remember, order comes from example. They follow what they see." Luciano nodded slowly. He had learned that lesson years ago when Torrio handed him the keys to the future. Still, he couldn't help but think about the men he'd lost to greed, betrayal, or impatience. "You ever regret it?" Luciano asked quietly. "Building this thing?" Torrio smiled faintly. "No. I regret that men always find new ways to destroy what they build, but not the building itself." That line stuck with Luciano for the rest of his life. After that meeting, Torrio retreated further into the background. He was like a chess player who'd won the game and quietly left the table, leaving others to play on the board he designed. The world, meanwhile, was changing fast. The Great Depression had ended, Prohibition was gone, and America was on the brink of war. The rackets had evolved. Gambling, unions, construction, and black markets were now the beating heart of the mob economy. Torrio saw it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had planned for this years in advance. He invested heavily in real estate, especially in Florida and New York. Legitimate money began to flow in, clean and steady. For a time, Torrio almost lived like a retired businessman. Mornings were peaceful, newspapers, walks, polite nods from neighbors who had no idea of the empire that bowed to his influence. But he never truly stopped working. He was the silent advisor for powerful men, both legitimate and not. Lawyers, politicians, even judges occasionally sought his counsel, not because they knew his past, but because they sensed his intelligence. Torrio had that effect. He made you feel as though every decision was part of a grander plan, even if it wasn't. He'd sometimes travel to Chicago, quietly, discreetly. The city had changed. Slicker, faster, but still humming with corruption. He'd visit old allies like Frank Nitti or the remnants of Capone's organization, though he kept his visits brief. The Chicago outfit was now its own machine, but it still followed Torrio's old blueprint. No chaos, no headlines, and no unnecessary blood. During one of these trips, he met a younger generation of gangsters who'd grown up hearing stories about him, half myth, half man. They looked at him with awe, as though he were a relic from a golden age. "You're Johnny Torrio," one of them said, almost in disbelief. "The guy who made the mob into a business." Torrio smiled faintly. "Into a system," he corrected. "A business can fail. A system adapts." That was the lesson few ever understood. The real genius of Torrio wasn't the empire he built. It was the way he taught others how to make empires survive. Yet for all his success, Torrio sometimes felt the weight of time. The men he had mentored were either dead, imprisoned, or ghosts in their own cities. Capone was a broken man, his mind fading away in a Florida estate. Luciano had been exiled after the war, his power reduced but his influence eternal. Torrio, meanwhile, was free, but alone. One evening, sitting by his window as the sun sank over the East River, Torrio found himself remembering the first time he ever set foot in Chicago. He had been young then, ambitious, eager to prove himself. Now he was older, wiser, and finally understood the irony. The same city that had almost killed him had made him immortal. In the distance, he could hear the city's heartbeat, the faint hum of life, the distant echo of sirens, the rhythm of a world that never truly changed. He thought about the men who were still fighting over scraps of power, the endless cycle of greed and betrayal, and for the first time he allowed himself a quiet laugh. "Let them fight," he whispered. "I already won." That night, as the city glowed beneath a silver moon, Johnny Torrio, the calm mind behind the chaos, the mentor of legends, the man who taught criminals to think like kings, closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his legacy moving through the streets. It was no longer his to control, but it was his design. By the early 1940s, Johnny Torrio had become almost invisible, and that's exactly how he wanted it. The streets that once whispered his name now spoke of others: Luciano, Costello, Lansky. The new generation had taken the blueprint he created and built skyscrapers of crime upon it. Torrio didn't envy them. He watched from a distance like an architect admiring a skyline he designed long ago. He lived modestly in a quiet neighborhood, far from the noise of gangland power. His neighbors saw a polite, well-dressed older man who always tipped the newspaper boy and kept his lawn perfectly trimmed. They didn't know that this same man had once ruled the bloodiest streets in Chicago without firing a shot. Johnny's days began early. He'd wake up before sunrise, pour himself black coffee, and sit by the window while the city stirred awake. It wasn't the same city he remembered. It was cleaner, faster, colder. The era of speakeasies and smoky rooms was gone, replaced by neon signs and chrome diners. But beneath that new shine, Torrio could still sense the same old machinery: deals, secrets, quiet power, humming beneath the surface. Every few months, he'd receive visits from men who looked out of place in his quiet neighborhood. Expensive suits, polished shoes, eyes that never stopped scanning. They'd arrive under the guise of business associates, but Torrio knew what they really were: disciples paying respect to their silent teacher. One of them was Meyer Lansky. He had become the financial mind of organized crime, the banker of empires. Lansky admired Torrio deeply. He saw him not just as a legend, but as a visionary. Over cigars one afternoon, Lansky leaned forward and said, "You know, Johnny, if there's one thing we all learned from you, it's that control doesn't come from fear. It comes from organization." Torrio smiled faintly. "Fear is like fire, Meyer. It burns bright, but it always burns out. Structure, that lasts." They talked for hours, not about money or territory, but about ideas, stability, longevity, legacy. Torrio's mind was as sharp as ever. He spoke of systems, alliances, and rules, principles that would outlive all of them. As Lansky left, he shook Torrio's hand and said, "You might have retired, Johnny, but the world still runs on your playbook." Torrio watched him go, smiling quietly. He didn't need power anymore. He had something better: influence. But beneath that calm surface there was a growing melancholy. He was proud of what he had built, but he couldn't ignore what it had cost. The violence, the betrayals, the young men who had died chasing power that vanished as quickly as it came. They were all pieces of the same empire he'd helped create. Sometimes late at night, he'd walk the streets alone. He'd pass by restaurants where he once dined with Capone, now replaced by modern cafes with bright lights and laughter. No one recognized him. To them, he was just another old man lost in thought. One night, a man in his 20s approached him. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Aren't you Johnny Torrio?" Torrio hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Used to be," he replied. The young man grinned nervously. "My uncle used to talk about you, said you were the smartest man the streets ever saw." Torrio chuckled softly. "Smart? Maybe. Lucky? Definitely. But tell your uncle this. The streets don't love anyone. They just let you rent space for a while." The kid laughed awkwardly, not realizing the weight of what Torrio had just said. As the young man walked away, Torrio's gaze lingered on the streetlights reflecting in the rain-soaked pavement. He knew he was nearing the end of his story. He had outlived almost everyone: Capone, Dean O'Banion, Frankie Yale, even the ones who once tried to kill him. Outliving enemies was its own kind of victory, but also a lonely one. He thought often about Capone, the boy he'd mentored into a leader who had turned into something he couldn't control. Torrio never hated Capone. He pitied him. The world wasn't kind to men who burned too brightly. Sometimes Torrio would receive letters from old associates written in careful code. Some spoke of new ventures, others of arrests or betrayals. He'd read them slowly, then tuck them away in a drawer he never opened twice. The business no longer belonged to him, and he didn't miss it. What he did miss was purpose, the thrill of strategy, the challenge of keeping chaos contained. But he knew chasing it again would destroy the peace he'd finally earned. As the war years passed, Torrio invested quietly in legal enterprises, hotels, real estate, even a few factories. By the end of the 1940s, his wealth was substantial, clean, and nearly invisible. No one could tie him to anything illegal. He was, at least on paper, a retired gentleman investor. Still, every now and then, a familiar figure would appear. An old soldier from Chicago, a former associate from the old days. They'd sit together, talk about the past, and share a glass of whiskey. But Torrio noticed something. Every story they told ended the same way, with regret. One of them said once, "Johnny, you were the only one who knew when to get out. The rest of us stayed too long." Torrio nodded. "That's the curse of success," he said quietly. "It makes you think you can't lose." He wasn't bitter. He'd simply learned that in their world, victory and survival weren't the same thing. One afternoon in 1950, Torrio sat in his garden reading the newspaper when a headline caught his eye. "Senate investigates organized crime. The Kefauver hearings begin." He read the article carefully. Names, places, connections, all being dragged into the light. Men he once knew were being questioned, exposed. He smiled faintly, folding the paper. "They're chasing ghosts," he muttered. And in a way they were. Because by then, Johnny Torrio had already faded into legend, the architect who had built a kingdom of order out of chaos, then stepped aside before it crumbled. He leaned back, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun, and thought, maybe this is what peace feels like. By the 1950s, Johnny Torrio had become something like a ghost who still cast a shadow. He was alive, yes, but to the world of organized crime, he was more a memory than a man. He had transcended it, in a way few ever did. No indictments, no shootouts, no tragic fall from power, just quiet endurance. The newspapers rarely mentioned him anymore, except in passing. When they did, it was usually in the same breath as Al Capone or Lucky Luciano, names that had burned bright and fast. But Torrio's story was different. His was a story of restraint, of knowing when to step away. And that's what kept him alive long after others were gone. He still met with a few trusted associates, men who operated quietly in the background, financial advisors, lawyers, a few figures in the construction and real estate world who owed their success to him. They called him Mr. Torrio, never Johnny, and spoke to him with a reverence usually reserved for bishops or professors. But even for a man as composed as Torrio, time had a way of softening the edges. His once steely posture had relaxed. His steps were slower now. Still, his mind was sharp. And that mind, that calculating brilliance, remained his greatest weapon. One evening around 1952, he was visited by an old acquaintance from New York, a man connected to the Luciano family, who wanted Torrio's opinion on a new problem. The man spoke about expansion, territory, and alliances, about how the syndicate was evolving with the post-war boom. He asked Torrio if he thought the future of organized crime still had a place in America. Torrio listened patiently, then said, "As long as men want power without limits and money without patience, there will always be crime. But the real power," he added, tapping his temple, "will belong to the ones who stay invisible." It was a phrase that would echo through generations. After that meeting, Torrio's involvement became even quieter. He still offered advice through intermediaries, though fewer people dared to approach him directly. He had no need for attention. His influence lived on in the very structure of modern organized crime. Every rule, every council, every negotiation among families was built on his vision of balance and order. Yet Torrio often felt like a man out of time. The new generation of gangsters, flashy, reckless, drawn to fame, reminded him too much of the era he had escaped. The headlines were filled with stories of shootouts, betrayals, and mobsters being paraded before Senate hearings. They called it the golden age of the mafia. But Torrio only saw foolishness. One night, while sitting by the radio, he heard a commentator say, "The mafia has grown too big to hide." He smiled to himself and whispered, "Then it's grown too big to last." He was right. The 1950s brought with them a different kind of America. Television, suburban life, corporate ambition, all of it eroded the old ways. Even the mob was changing, becoming more corporate, more sophisticated, but less human. The days of loyalty and mentorship were gone. Now, men trusted money more than they trusted each other. Torrio spent his last years between New York and Brooklyn, living quietly in modest apartments, never staying too long in one place. He wrote letters, carefully worded, coded, often philosophical. Some were sent to old friends like Meyer Lansky or political figures who owed him favors. Others were never mailed at all. One letter found after his death read, "We built something that was meant to last forever, but forever is shorter than we think. The world doesn't remember the builder, only the building. Maybe that's enough." In 1956, at the age of 75, Torrio was called to testify before a grand jury about organized crime connections to business interests. The news spread fast. Reporters were stunned. Johnny Torrio, the man behind Capone, the man who had vanished decades ago, was being pulled back into the light. When he arrived at the courthouse, people expected a frail old man. Instead, they saw calm authority. He wore a dark suit, walked without assistance, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His testimony was polite, precise, and deliberately vague. He spoke in circles that led nowhere. The prosecutors left frustrated. A reporter caught him outside and asked, "Mr. Torrio, do you have any regrets about your life in crime?" He smiled gently and said, "Son, the only crime I ever committed was trusting people who thought they were smarter than me." Then he tipped his hat and walked away. That night, back in his apartment, Torrio sat alone. The city outside was restless, as it always had been. He could hear the faint hum of traffic, the distant sound of a siren. It felt like an echo of the past, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to drift back, to Chicago, to the roaring 1920s, to the men who had once walked beside him. He thought of Capone, of Luciano, of Yale and O'Banion, of the countless faces who had passed through his life. Some had loved him, some had feared him, but all had learned from him. He wondered what they'd say if they could see him now, the last survivor of an age built on ambition and blood. A few weeks later, Torrio collapsed at his desk while reading the newspaper. A heart attack, sudden and quiet. He was gone before anyone could reach him. His funeral was small and discreet. No grand display, no spectacle, just a few old men in dark suits, heads bowed, paying respects to the one man who had taught them what true power looked like: control, patience, and the wisdom to walk away. There were no headlines, no monuments, just silence. But in the underworld, his name lived on like a quiet whisper. Torrio, the architect. The man who turned gangsters into businessmen and chaos into a system. The man who proved that the greatest victories were the ones nobody saw. In the years after Johnny Torrio's quiet death, his name slipped from newspapers, but never from the corridors of organized power. His body was gone, but his ideas, the bones of modern organized crime, continued to shape everything that came after. Those who survived him knew it. They felt it every time they held a meeting, brokered a truce, or spoke of business instead of crime. Lucky Luciano once said in a hushed interview overseas, "Without Johnny, there'd be no us. He was the one who made it all make sense." And that was true. Torrio had taken chaos and dressed it in a suit. By the late 1950s, America's underworld was thriving in new ways. Gambling, labor unions, construction contracts, casinos in Havana and Las Vegas, all of it flowed through the quiet networks Torrio had first envisioned. Even the way mobsters spoke changed. Less about revenge, more about percentages. Torrio had taught them that blood was messy, but business left cleaner fingerprints. In New York, Meyer Lansky sat in a small apartment overlooking the East River, reading a letter that had arrived months after Torrio's death. It had been mailed from a lawyer in Chicago. Inside was a note, written in Torrio's unmistakably neat handwriting. "Meyer, the future will not belong to the loudest man in the room. It will belong to the quietest one. Protect the system. Let the rest fade." Lansky folded the note carefully and locked it in his desk. He would keep it for the rest of his life. In those years, organized crime began its transformation into something Torrio had once predicted: a shadow corporation that moved like smoke through every corner of American life. Politicians, unions, Hollywood, casinos, real estate. Each had a thread that led back to someone who had learned, directly or indirectly, from Torrio's model. The commission, the council of bosses Luciano and Lansky had built, was still functioning, despite internal rivalries. Every major decision passed through that invisible government before reaching the streets. It was order, not chaos. And though few dared say his name aloud, everyone knew where that order began. But the world outside the shadows was changing fast. The FBI was growing stronger, hungrier. Television and newspapers were starting to pull the curtain back. New agents, new laws, and new technologies meant that secrecy was harder to maintain. J. Edgar Hoover's once blind eye toward organized crime had opened. Suddenly, the old balance Torrio created was in danger of collapsing under exposure. Still, his disciples adapted. They went underground again, more subtle, more corporate, hiding behind clean records and legitimate businesses. Torrio would have approved. He had always believed survival came from flexibility, not bravado. Lansky, especially, followed Torrio's lessons like scripture. He created networks that operated like financial institutions, moving money through countries and companies no one could trace. "The secret," he once told an associate, "is to look more honest than the honest man." That was pure Torrio. Even Las Vegas, the city that rose out of the desert like a monument to greed, carried Torrio's fingerprints. The partnership between mobsters and legitimate investors, casinos run with precision, silent profits flowing to backroom investors. That was the world Torrio imagined decades earlier. Business first, violence last. But time, as always, had its own plans. By the 1960s, the new generation of gangsters cared less for subtlety. They wanted fame, headlines, fast money. Torrio's philosophy of order began to erode under the weight of ego. Violence returned, and with it came the heat he had warned against. In smoky backrooms in New York and Chicago, older men would shake their heads and mutter, "If Torrio was still around, this wouldn't be happening." They were right. Torrio understood something none of them could fully grasp. Empires don't die from enemies, they die from impatience. Still, his legend persisted in unexpected places. Some young mobsters studied old stories about him like sacred text. They admired how he survived, how he walked away. "That's real power," one said. "To leave when you want, not when they make you." Meanwhile, historians began piecing his story together, though much of it was rumor and myth. They painted him as a ghostly figure behind Capone, the wise strategist who preferred silence over spectacle. Few ever knew how deeply his influence ran. Even government agents found themselves tracing lines back to Torrio's early structures: the business fronts, the offshore accounts, the coded communication systems. He had created blueprints they were still struggling to untangle. Meyer Lansky once told a journalist off the record, "The old man used to say, 'Make it look boring and they'll stop looking.' That's the trick. That's why Johnny lived free." And maybe that was the truest summary of Torrio's genius. While others chased fame or fear, he built invisibility. His name was never the headline, but it was always behind it. Decades later, when the mob began to crumble under indictments and betrayals, when wiretaps replaced handshakes and loyalty turned into liability, older gangsters would reminisce about the gentleman days. They'd talk about Torrio with something close to reverence. "He ran it like a business," one said during an interview in the 1980s. "We all thought we were businessmen, but he was one. He knew the rules. He just rewrote them." In a sense, Torrio never really died. His philosophies lived on in boardrooms, banks, and even in the way corporations learned to operate. Quietly ruthless, endlessly strategic, always 3 steps ahead. Some scholars later argued that Torrio's ideas blurred the line between organized crime and corporate America itself. The man didn't just invent the modern mob, one writer said. He invented a way of thinking, profit without conscience, control without visibility. In a quiet cemetery in Brooklyn, his grave remained simple and unassuming. No grand marble statue, no visitors except the occasional historian or curious local, but every so often an old car would stop nearby. A man in a dark suit would step out, stand silently for a minute, and leave a single coin on the headstone before driving off. It was an old underworld gesture, the coin for the teacher. Torrio had built an empire, taught kings, and walked away before the throne collapsed. And while the world forgot his face, it never escaped his shadow. By the dawn of the 1970s, Johnny Torrio had been gone for more than 2 decades, yet his fingerprints still lingered across continents, buried beneath layers of corporate fronts, political alliances, and silent power plays. His lessons had not died. They had evolved. The men who once whispered his name in smoky backrooms were now older, wealthier, and more cautious. Meyer Lansky was living out his later years, balancing the life of a frail old man with the mind of a strategist who never stopped calculating. When asked in a rare interview about Torrio, Lansky only said, "He taught us how to build things that last longer than men." He wasn't exaggerating. In Las Vegas, the neon lights flickered over casinos that were practically temples to Torrio's philosophy, a perfect blend of legitimacy and corruption. The city was a stage show of capitalism and crime, where money flowed like water and no one asked too many questions. Behind every casino, behind every smiling entertainer and blinking slot machine, there were silent investors, men who still followed the principles Torrio had instilled decades before. He had dreamed of a system where the underworld and the overworld merged so tightly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Vegas was that dream made real. The skim operations, money quietly siphoned from casino profits before the government could see it, were straight out of Torrio's playbook. The methods were clean, mechanical, almost beautiful in their simplicity. The violence that once stained Chicago's streets had been replaced with quiet manipulation, paperwork, and offshore transfers. Torrio had always said that paper killed faster than bullets. By now, the mob was global. Havana had fallen after Castro's revolution, but Lansky and his network had already spread their roots across the Caribbean, into South America, and even into European financial systems. From Swiss banks to Panamanian shell companies, Torrio's blueprint had gone international. And though his name was rarely spoken, the architects of these modern operations all studied his methods: compartmentalization, discipline, and above all, invisibility. Even the CIA, during its covert operations in the Cold War, unknowingly borrowed ideas from Torrio's system. Decentralized networks, plausible deniability, money trails hidden through layers of legality. It was ironic. The same government that once hunted Torrio's protégés now used his principles to run secret wars. But not everyone remembered him kindly. Among the new generation of mobsters, there were those who mocked the old ways. Men like Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo and later John Gotti saw Torrio's subtlety as weakness. They wanted to be seen, feared, admired. They wanted the headlines. They forgot Torrio's golden rule: attention is poison. And just as he had predicted, that craving for attention became the mob's undoing. When Gotti strutted before cameras in designer suits, older men shook their heads. Torrio would have never allowed this circus, they'd mutter. They were right. Torrio's genius had been in the art of disappearance. Gotti's downfall, televised and theatrical, was the ultimate proof that Torrio's lessons had been forgotten. Meanwhile, in boardrooms far from the streets, Torrio's vision had found a new kind of immortality. Corporate America, massive, faceless, profit-driven, was operating on the same logic Torrio introduced to organized crime: compartmentalization, delegation, profit before loyalty, secrecy behind public smiles. Some historians would later write that Torrio's ideas outgrew the mob itself, that he had unknowingly designed the DNA of modern capitalism. And yet, for all his influence, Torrio remained a ghost in the records. He left no confessions, no autobiography, no grand farewell speech. Only memories whispered by men who both admired and feared him. In 1972, a journalist researching a book on the early Chicago outfit interviewed a retired accountant who had once worked for Torrio. The old man described him simply: "He was the first man I ever saw who could make crime look respectable. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He'd just look at you and say, 'Why make a mess when you can make a deal?' And you'd agree. Always." By the late 70s, the FBI had shifted its focus toward organized white-collar crime, uncovering webs of corruption that stretched from Wall Street to Washington. Agents often joked that the mobster mentality had gone to college, but few realized it was Torrio's ghost they were chasing. When the Senate held hearings on casino corruption, Meyer Lansky's name appeared again and again. His testimony was calm, rehearsed, polite, a reflection of Torrio's teachings. But Lansky's voice shook slightly when a senator asked if he ever regretted the life he'd chosen. After a long pause, he replied, "Regret. Only that Johnny didn't live long enough to see how right he was." In that single line, Lansky revealed everything. Torrio's true legacy wasn't blood or bullets. It was the merging of power and invisibility. As the years passed, the lines between crime and commerce blurred even more. Political donations, offshore accounts, insider trading. These were the new rackets, dressed in legal clothing. Torrio's blueprint had outlasted the men who built it. Even after the mob began to crumble under RICO laws and informants, the system Torrio inspired survived, because it no longer needed gangsters to operate. The game had been institutionalized. And so, by the 1980s, Torrio's influence stretched beyond Chicago or New York. It reached into Wall Street boardrooms, global banks, intelligence agencies, and political machines. His lessons had become universal. Control quietly, profit endlessly, and vanish when the lights turn on. In one dusty FBI memo from 1983, an analyst wrote while investigating international money laundering, "Every time we dig deep enough, the structure looks the same. Small, tight, efficient, almost elegant. It's like chasing the ghost of Johnny Torrio." The ghost, it seemed, was everywhere. By the time the world crossed into the 1990s, Johnny Torrio had been gone for nearly half a century. But somehow, his presence lingered like perfume after a powerful woman has left the room. You couldn't see him, but you could feel him everywhere money moved quietly, where influence was traded with a smile instead of a threat, and where power operated behind curtains rather than on stages. His ghost lived not in the alleys of Chicago anymore, but in glass towers, private jets, and the quiet corridors of global finance. The city that once bled for him had transformed into a museum of ambition. The neighborhoods that echoed with gunfire in the 1920s were now gentrified blocks of coffee shops, boutiques, and luxury condos. Yet beneath the polished streets, the structure Torrio had designed, the very idea of organized order, still pulsed like a heartbeat. Chicago had learned his rules. Don't show your hand, don't make noise, and make everyone think you're just another businessman. Some scholars began to call Torrio the father of American enterprise, though they didn't mean it kindly. His organized systems of control had slipped beyond criminal circles and merged with legitimate institutions. The mob had learned from corporations, but corporations had learned just as much from the mob. Offshore accounts, shadow ownerships, invisible partnerships. These weren't accidents of modern finance. They were echoes of Torrio's structure. Even in popular culture, his influence resurfaced. Films and novels romanticized Al Capone's violence, but the truly sharp minds in Hollywood gravitated to Torrio's quiet, strategic style. Characters like Michael Corleone, Gustavo Fring, and other gentleman criminals were his spiritual descendants, all guided by the same principle: keep your empire clean, your enemies confused, and your name out of the papers. In the early 2000s, an old historian named Charles Dunn unearthed a forgotten interview transcript with Torrio from the mid-1930s. The piece had never been published, perhaps because it didn't fit the era's appetite for gangster glamour. In it, Torrio spoke calmly about the future of America. "The country will grow too rich for bullets," he said. "The smart men won't fight for streets. They'll buy the men who own the streets." When the transcript was finally made public decades later, economists marveled at its eerie accuracy. That was Torrio, decades ahead of everyone else, not just in crime, but in understanding how the world truly works. He understood that the real power didn't lie in violence. It lived in the ability to control the flow of money without ever appearing to touch it. By the 2010s, when financial scandals like the Panama Papers and corporate leaks exposed global webs of hidden wealth, investigative journalists noted something uncanny. The structures they uncovered resembled Torrio's model almost perfectly: layers of control, offshore protection, compartmentalization, plausible deniability. The irony was almost poetic. Johnny Torrio's ghost was now haunting billionaires and politicians rather than bootleggers and gamblers. He had once said, "Crime is business. Business is organization. Organization is civilization." It sounded outrageous in the 1920s, but by the 21st century, it was practically a thesis statement for global economics. His vision had long since escaped. Morality, it was just the way the world worked. If you walked through Chicago's Little Italy today, you might find an old tavern with faded photographs on the wall, black and white, grainy, showing young men in suits too sharp for their age. Somewhere in that gallery might be Torrio's calm, unreadable face, half smiling like a man who knew a secret no one else could see. Tourists pass by without noticing, but those who know the story feel something different. They sense the quiet hum of legacy, not one built on fear, but on intellect. Historians still debate his morality. Some call him the gentleman criminal, who elevated the mob from chaos to order. Others see him as the original architect of corruption, the man who proved that you could merge illegality with respectability, and no one would stop you if you wore the right suit. Both might be right. Torrio never claimed to be good or bad. He only wanted to be effective. And perhaps that's why his story endures. He didn't die in a blaze of gunfire like Capone, or end up in witness protection like others. He simply disappeared